push versus machine. Let's go. So push 3 or machine plus, which one is right for you? This is the video I've been wanting to make for quite a long time, and obviously it's been made possible because Ableton have released their Ableton 3 controller, which is a completely standalone version of push, which kind of brings them into the same kind of league as machine plus, being completely standalone as well. I absolutely love both of these. I've been using them for quite some time, so I kind of want to take this opportunity to be able to do a bit of a deep dive on both of these, compare some of the features, the workflow, and also have a look at some of the software integration as well. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so let's take a look at the hardware. Before I do that, let's just ramble off a few specs to provide some context. A machine, we've got 4 gig of RAM, we've got a quad-core processor, and we've got a 32 gigabyte internal SSD hard drive. Plus, on the side, we have a 64 gigabyte SD card, which is expandable to 1 terabyte for saving all of your samples and projects, okay? Push, we have 8 gigs of RAM, we've got an i3 processor, and we also have 256 gigabyte internal SSD storage drive, okay? So there's some context. Also think that if you ever need more space, which is insane, you've always got your computer to be a backup drive for all of your projects anyway, okay? So with push, as you can see, it's pretty obvious. We've got this kind of 8x8 pad layout, giving you 64 pads in total. And this is quite nice for, you know, being able to be a bit more expressive, as you've got a lot of range for being able to play notes and sounds with the pads. If I go over to something melodic here, so the green pad here in this case is identifying the root note, and if I go to scale and I've got in key mode selected with a D minor scale, it's sort of, you know, quantizing all the notes to be in a D minor scale, and it kind of like allows you to sort of be able to play just using 3 fingers an entire scale, which is really, really nice, and one of the things I really like about push. Plus you've got all this extra range, so it kind of makes your playing experience, you know, different and a little bit and quite nice. Plus, if you want to play something like, you know, play some chords, you can kind of come up with some pretty simple like finger chord shapes to be able to play a chord. So in this instance, it's the 1st, 3rd, and the 5th. So I can play a very simple triad. So if you can kind of get creative, I've seen a lot of users do it, you can kind of come up with some really interesting chord progressions. Oh, and not forgetting the big one here, which is MPE. So these pads on push are MPE compatible, meaning that you get a whole new layer of expression, more so than just being velocity sensitive. I have this sound here, and the harder I press, it's modulating that cutoff filter. But all of these notes work independently of one another. So the harder or softer I press on each note, it makes the cutoff filter modulate in different ways, giving you that really kind of, interesting dynamic kind of expression. Plus it responds to slide and glide. There's a lot of extra layers of expression you have there. Plus there's a whole lot of presets that are preloaded with Push 3 that you can just browse through that are relative straight with MPE. Moving on to Maschine, we have the 16 pad kind of layout. So this sort of emulates more of your traditional Akai MPC style sort of layout with the 16 pads. Each pad triggers a sound, but we've also got these 8 groups here. So each group holds or contains a new set of new sounds. So there's a lot of sounds that you can actually play. Each pad will kind of more or less sort of be able to play or control a sample, a loop, or an actual VST that comes preloaded with Maschine. So here I just have a couple of drum samples. Here I have something melodic. So like Push, if I wanted to be able to play a sound chromatically or melodically, I've got a dedicated button for it called keyboard mode. So now I can play these sounds like a piano. The pads will sort of dedicate themselves to showing you what's going on via these displays here. So I've got a minor scale selected and the root note is an A. So I have an A minor scale. And you can see these pads here are sort of like highlighted, similar to what's happening with Push, and that's showing me the root note. So between here and here is an A minor scale. Again, this is really useful stuff for coming up with bass lines, melodies, and other kind of chord progressions. Speaking about chords, much like Push, if I want to play some chords, Push you have the option of coming up with some sort of like finger arrangements. You can do that in Maschine obviously, but you've got less pads, so there's actually a dedicated chord button for it. If I press this here, navigate to this sound, I can trigger a chord just using a single pad. And up here I can see on the displays that I've got 1, 3, 5, and 7. So that's the chord shape, right? And I can change that. So I've got, the 1, 3, and 5, so it's a regular triad. And it actually shows you what notes are being played every time I trigger that chord. So again, these things are really useful for coming up with like chord progressions and melodies. Both have these options of doing this, but just in sort of different ways. If you wanted to have a different scale, you could just change the root note and change the scale type over here, and that kind of gives you different ways of playing as well. So moving back to Push, coming from the top down, we've got these 8 encoder dials up here, and these give you access to everything from changing volume on your track mixer to editing parameters on your instrument devices. These buttons will select different racks that you've got set up. So here I've got a simpler. This button will engage the saturator effect, chorus, and the compressor. And if you've got like sort of racks set up, you can double click and it will actually like load you into the rack, and you can kind of like deep dive into whatever you've got set up, which is handy. These buttons down here will help you select between different tracks that you've got set up. So there's my kick, here's my drums, here I have a synth, so on and so forth, and you can just kind of navigate between all of your tracks through here. Or you can use this little these little navigation arrows as well. You can just sort of select between all the tracks that you've got loaded in your session. This is for your master volume. If you click, it will change the level of your headphone volume, master, etc. Very important, a save button. I like it that it's, there's a save button right there that you can just like always come to it and just click save whenever you need to. Mute, solo. Here we've got a tempo button. Down here we've got a pitch bend, tap tempo, quantize, transport function. This is all kind of like your sort of generic workflow sort of stuff. And then down the side here we've got some other things that you can use for, say, switching between note mode and your clip launcher. So you can sort of see like all your clips set up. These buttons will trigger an entire scene, which is a row of clips. Or you can just trigger clips individually. Plus you've also got a clip view button up here as well. So you can kind of like see all that. One of the newer features on the Push 3 is the this big jog wheel, which is kind of used for being able to navigate between clips and scenes, and also when you're browsing through all of your content. So if we go to this plus icon and we want to create like a new MIDI track, we can use this to navigate through. It'll go side to side, and we can use it to click to enter, which is quite useful, and it feels really nice. It has this kind of like nice sort of click to it. We move back to Maschine, we can see that there's quite a lot of similarities here. So we've got the 8 encoders here, and these are assigned to all of the parameters on the display. And speaking of the display, we've got 2 displays here, right? So one will show you what plugin or instrument you've got loaded, and then over on this side will show you things like presets and all this kind of stuff. If you're in the track mixer, it just sort of splits the 2 displays into 2, but like the displays are kind of designed to have like a focus and then kind of like a sub page as well. All right, all of these will assign to whatever parameters you've got loaded at that time. So if in the track mixer, it'll just be for the volumes. If you're in your plugin mode, it'll be for all the main parameters for that plugin. This is our jog wheel here. The jog wheel on Maschine, I find, works a lot better. It has a lot more functionality, and in fact, these little lights on the jog wheel actually show you kind of like where you can sort of navigate to. In this instance, when I'm in an effect, I can easily just sort of navigate between my plugin and an effect that I have on the effects chain. And then I can navigate again, click, and load up another effect if I like. So it has quite a lot of use. If you're in the mixer page, you can sort of scroll between like all of your tracks and just make all of the necessary edits that you need to. It has quite a lot of extra functionality, more so than I found the jog wheel on Push. I feel like Push could probably sort of upgrade with a firmware update at some stage. I'm sure it's in the work to be able to give it a bit more functionality, but this on Maschine has a bit more functionality. Plus, if I'm in the browser mode, navigating through all of my content, I can use it to scroll through different presets and then use the encoders up here to navigate between different plugins as well, right? So we've got groups down here, we've got pitch bend and mod wheel through here, transport buttons. These are the sort of like the main sort of like input modes for being able to control your sounds. So pad mode, keyboard mode, chord mode, and step sequencer. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. So yeah, there's a few similarities, but yeah, a little bit of difference between just how it kind of integrates with its own software. So now if we move to the back, both of these units have a built-in audio interface, which is amazing. We have 2 line outputs on both, plus 2 line inputs as well. There's MIDI in and MIDI out, although Push requires this little adapter because it's got the 3.5mm MIDI input, which is good. I prefer the 5-pin, but having an adapter is fine. You can see that the build of this is a little bit sort of deeper, so it obviously houses a bigger plug, which is fine. USB port, and I suppose I've forgotten to mention that Push actually has an internal battery, so we don't even need the power supply. The battery works for about 2 hours-ish, depending on how hard you're running it with so many plugs. So if that's important to you, yeah, Push has that. There's no internal battery on Maschine. But let me weigh in on the battery debate for a minute. I am not fazed about having an internal battery. I rarely find myself making beats on a bus or on a plane with one of these units. I generally don't carry it around. It stays in the studio. Maybe I'll go to a friend's house and make beats there, but they're gonna have a power supply anyway. The place I would be making beats the most though, outside of the studio, would be my couch, right? So having a battery and not having to worry about the power supply is a luxury for sure, but you're really gonna have to need it again after a couple hours, and so anyway, that's just me. Whatever you feel about having a battery, if it's important to you, then that's awesome. For me, if there was no battery, maybe we could have made it a little bit cheaper. Anyway, Push has no battery, but it comes with a power supply. It comes with this really smart power supply. It comes with this little locking mechanism, so you can't pull it out, so no one can sort of trip on the cable and pull it out and lose your session mid-set, so that's kind of handy as well. But what Push does have is it has ADAT, which is a really interesting addition to Push and the audio interface side of things, because that means you can essentially expand the amount of audio inputs and audio outputs coming in and out of Push. I personally don't have an audio interface with ADAT. I run everything into just a track mixer, but I can see how this would be really, really useful for a lot of people, especially if you're running lots of channels and you want to be processing them individually or sending lots of stuff in. If you've got a big studio full of hardware synths and you want to have a template session full of pre-mapped instrument devices and you want to run all that audio into Push. So yeah, that's a really awesome addition. Maschine, you've just got your 2-line audio inputs, but you can expand the audio outputs if you connect it to another audio interface. So say, a regular class compliant audio interface, Complete Audio 6 would be a good example. You can expand your audio inputs that way. So a bit of a workaround. Alright, so let's make a beat on each, starting with the Push. Gonna lay down some drums, add a bass line, and add some other melodic parts. And then we'll move over and do the same thing with the Push, and we'll take a bit of a look at how the workflow of each works. So over here, this is with Push. You can see that how Push works is it's actually the closest to how your digital audio workstation kind of operates as far as you loading sounds on individual tracks. Right, and each of these buttons here will select any of the tracks that you have loaded, and then this button over here will cycle between any of the extra tracks that you do. I have a drum rack loaded on this particular track here, and you can see that that's how the pad changes in its sort of behavior, which is different to say something like a melodic track that plays like an instrument with pitches. It sort of changes the behavior to show the keyboard layout like this, right? And if you're browsing for tracks, you can press this plus icon and then use the encoder jog wheel to kind of navigate between any of the sounds that you're looking to load, relative to whatever it is. So whether it's a drum or an instrument, adding an audio effect, MIDI clip, etc., right? So this is a drum rack with some sort of effect sounds. This one I already have loaded up. It's got it's a drum rack just exclusively for kicks, right? And then I've got some other percussive drum sounds here. Next, kind of like a deep swirling chord sound, like a bass, and some chords as well. So let's go ahead and lay that down. Now, if you haven't already guessed, I'm a bit of a house head. I'm going to lay down some kind of deep groovy house vibes here. And a great place to start is with the kick drum, right? So I select this, and now you can see that the pad behavior kind of changes a bit. We've got this 32-step sequencer here, right? And it runs kind of from left to right. So if I start adding in some kick drum sounds, put one there, there. You can see the playhead, which is that pad that's lit up and cycling through, actually goes through and plays a sequence. If I press my clip button, you can see there's all this down here. This shows you all the MIDI events within your clip, and you can use the jog wheel to cycle through each one and make any necessary adjustments like velocity and note lengths and all that kind of thing. We'll go to the next track. Let's lay down a clap. Put this on the 5th step. So each pad becomes a step in your sequence, right? So relative to this, the step value that I've got it set to, which is in this case 16ths. So this is the 5th step, and this basically becomes the up step or the upbeat of the groove. Let's just go ahead and add some more sounds. Now the great thing about this, and one of my favorite things about Push, is just being able to kind of go through and build sounds on sounds to work out how your track's going to sound. So I'll go through, let's layer it with another clap. Never have too many claps. And we'll get this open hat. And so this is going to go there and there. All right, and then we're just going to boom, boom, boom. Cool. let's add a few more sounds. And the thing I like about the step sequencer is you can just kind of be a little bit random with it, you know, and sort of see what works and what doesn't. And if you want to remove a sound from the sequence, just tap the pad and it will take it out. Cool. Maybe just remove a couple of these. You know, and if you're not liking that, you can just kind of like take them all out and just replace it with another sound. And we'll get like another sound here. Cool, sounding pretty good for now. We can always come back and add some more sounds to it afterwards. Let's move on to the next sound I have, which is this kind of like deep sort of chord sound. And when you press this button, this will show you your instrument as well. It will show you all the macros that you can control with these knobs up the top. And if you want to dive deep and make some more adjustments to all of your sounds, you can press this little tab here and it will open up the instrument rack. And you can select all of the things that come within this instrument rack. Now, this can be a little bit confusing sometimes because to dive really deep and see all the like necessary things that you're looking for can be a little bit limiting because of the size of the screen, and you're actually like opening up some really complex instrument racks as well. So it can be sometimes a little bit cumbersome to dive really deep. However, nonetheless, I feel like it does a really good job of like, you know, navigating through all these really complex racks. So let's lay that down. So I'm just gonna hit the record button. Cool, and you've got this button here called quantize, and then that will just adjust the notes to the value. And here you can see that's my chord. And then again, just back to the macros. So these are just like already mapped so that you don't need to dive super deep into all of the instrument racks just to kind of get control over the most used parameters that you would really need, like cutoff filter. Nice. Let's move over to this sound, which is my bass sound. It's an instance of operator. There's loads of stuff going on here. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. Let's just kind of like record and lay something down. Now this might be a good opportunity to show real quickly the multiple ways of sequencing. So you could obviously just hit record and just lay down some sound, some notes. But if I hit the layout button, the push acts as a melodic sequencer or a 32 note sequencer. Now this was something that you can do on push 2 as well. And it's something that I really like. You get the 32 step sequence up the top, but down here you can trigger each note and just lay them down into the sequence, and then you can just decide which pitch that you want to select and just enter it in that way. So you can come up with some really unique, interesting ideas. And it's something that I haven't seen available on Maschine, which is a really nice touch. Nonetheless, I'm just going to do the old school way. Track mixer up here, just change the level of that sound a little bit. Nice. And lastly, just lay down some of these little chord sounds on the top. Nice one. So, you know, you can kind of get the vibe or a sense of how you can sort of like build tracks from scratch using your drums and your bass and your melodies and all your different elements. Just quickly, this button over here, this takes you to your session view. So this is one of the things I love about Push the most, is being able to see all your different clips that you've created, and you can trigger individual scenes. So these are your scenes buttons. A scene is a group of clips or patterns. So you can really flesh out a musical idea using this mode here. And they're all these little cells, they're all corresponding to your tracks, so you can see which clip is for which channel, right? one of the major strengths of Push, I find, is being able to just kind of navigate through the scenes within your Push. And then there's this button up here, which is a new addition to the Push 3. And you can use the jog wheel to kind of like navigate through each individual clip slot. So it looks a little bit more like using clips as you might have known with Ableton. Cool, so obviously there's heaps more, but you know, in the interest of time, let's just move on, but you can kind of get a sense of the workflow using Push here, right? Cool, all right, so let's move over to Maschine. So Maschine works a little differently, although there are quite a few similarities. With Maschine, we have this kind of group structure here. So each group will hold different sounds, as I mentioned before, and each group will also hold its own independent patterns as well, which we can combine with one another. So let's just take a look. So I've got some sounds loaded up here. Some drum sounds, percussion, some little instance of massive, bass line or bass sound, chord stab. So if I was to be browsing from the get-go, I could press this browse button, and you can see the displays give you a really kind of like great visual feedback on what you're actually looking for. Okay, and it's one of the great strengths of Maschine. If I'm looking in the groups category, I can use this encoder, and you can see like all the tile icons that show you like what you're loading. These are expansion packs, and you know, it's quite visual, plus all the presets load up here. And if I go to say instruments, if I was going to load up a VST or a plugin, for instance, you can actually see the software title of what these are, right? So Massive, Monarch. So it's a lot easier to kind of navigate for your individual sounds. On Push, you kind of know to navigate through like the menu. It's all black and white, and there's no visuals, and you kind of just have to sort of like guess what they are, unless you've got some, you know, pre-mapped plugin presets, of course. Bear in mind, Push doesn't use any third-party plugins. It's only Ableton instrument devices, but Native Instruments, because they create a lot of their own plugins, they've made those available inside Maschine's ecosystem. So that's pretty awesome. Nonetheless, I've got some sounds here. Now, if I'm going to go create a pattern, I'll just go here, create a new pattern. I'll start with 1 bar, and it's a bit of a similar process with kind of constructing your beats and grooves, right? I'll start with my kick, like I always do. You can see this little pad here lights up and is showing you kind of like the playhead going through the sequence. And if I press this button, the step button, this is where I can actually start to enter in my notes relative to individual steps, just like on Push. Each pad now becomes a step within my sequence relative to a 16th grid. Okay, so each pad is a 16th note. So I'm going to add a kick. Now it goes differently. The pad sequence goes up, not side to side, so that can be a bit confusing if you're a user of both, of course. Right? And you can see here, that's my MIDI pattern. Cool. Now I can go back to press select, find my next sound. So I'll select this snare and just load it on the 5 and 13. Right, and get the open hat here, step, and it's a really smooth workflow of just sort of like, you know, going from your sound to the sequencer. Right, this here shows you like an overview of your entire MIDI pattern, and this just shows you a focus of the sound that you're using. Get this sound. Now, if you're looking to make adjustments within the clip, you've got these encoders here, so you can change the velocity of individual notes. You can change the pitch if it was something melodic. So you've got a fair bit of control, and it's quite intuitive, and it works really well. It's really smooth. Maschine. As far as like, it's really immediate and it's not lagging, just like Push. Push is very much the same. It's very immediate. There's no kind of lagging really. Unless of course you've got, 64 instances of Massive, which I saw some person do once, and they were trying to like break it, which obviously it's not going to handle very well. It's just silly though, isn't it? Okay, get some other sounds. This is all relative to a 128, 127 BPM, which I can change here using this tempo button. So I suppose the thing I'm trying to get across here is like these input buttons at the top are really useful for being able to control your sounds differently, right? Particularly with the step. I'll come to the keyboard and the chords in a second. May as well go to the bass line. Let's go, okay, well here we go. Let's just use the keyboard right now. So the cool thing about this is that now if I select an instrument like this, I can use the keyboard mode to essentially turn the pads into little pitches or a little tiny piano, right? I've got 16 pads, which means I've got 16 notes, so it's a little bit over an octave of sounds, but I can use these buttons to change the octave. I can go up and down octaves, or I can change the semitone as well. Here I've got an F loaded as my root note, and I can use this to change the scale, right? Which is super, super handy for people like me whose music theory is not very good, and who I'm just trying to look at being able to create some bass lines and melodies kind of really quickly, making sure that all my notes and sounds are in key. Something similar that Push has as well, which is the in key mode. So they both share that, which is really, really, really useful. So here it's just kind of about jamming a little bit. Let's just lay that down. Now if you want to make some changes to your instrument, you can press the plug-in button. So when you've got an instrument loaded, that's the device that's loaded right here. This is my effects chain, and all of these are my macros, similar to like on Push. You can make changes to all the most relevant macros for that instrument. You can dive deep and go through all the individual pages. Again, it can be a little bit cumbersome to go through and really deep dive and find all of the sounds you're really looking for. If you're looking to make your own presets and patches, my vibe would be to do it on the computer and then import it into Maschine. Same with Push. It's really just about loading up the sounds that you like in these kinds of devices. Diving too deep can get a little bit clunky, right? Cool, so let's add this little stab sound. If you need to make any volume adjustments, you've got the mixer here. The cool thing about the mixer in Maschine is that all of the channels are color coded, which kind of gives you a really good visual sense of what's going on. However, the ability to have sends and returns isn't quite as complex as, say, something like Push, where all of the sends and returns are just built in there, and you can just quickly, like, send an effect to something else within Push very simply. It's not quite as easy to do that within Maschine. To do it, you need to set up a group and have the input. It's possible, but it's just a little bit clunky. On Push, really nice. Cool, so you can kind of see where I'm going with this. I've got a bass line, I've got some chords. From here, I'd probably load down some strings. On group B, I've got some vocal sample setup. And in fact, I've got a whole bunch of other patterns pre-loaded. So you can see there the basic workflow of each. The patterns and the scenes are a little bit different. It's probably the big takeaway from the workflow of each of these. I find that using the scenes and the clips in Push is a little bit more intuitive as far as constructing kind of like an entire piece of music. You do have this scenes mode in Maschine, and you can like add a bunch of scenes and patterns together, and that works really well. In fact, there is an entire sequencer in Maschine for sequencing all of your tracks, and patterns together to create like an entire track. But I find it can be a little clunky to use, and I think it's been one of the feedbacks that NI's had over the years about using Maschine to sequence all of your patterns to create an entire track. It's always going to be better in the computer. Nonetheless, still a lot you can do with it. Okay, so let's take a look at software integration. Now, I'm acutely aware that a lot of you would be hell-bent on just using these in complete standalone mode, but there are a lot of really great software integration options that come with both. Ableton Push comes obviously with Ableton Intro, which is amazing. It's a complete, digital audio workstation. And Maschine comes with the Maschine 2 software, which is also a really fantastic and unique software option for, taking your projects from standalone mode and then, potentially finishing them on the computer. That's kind of the idea. Plus, you also have the option of importing and exporting projects from the hardware to computer, as well as importing and exporting samples, which is also a super important option that you need to be able to know how to do. So in this case, let's take a look at integrating Maschine with the software. So if I go to the settings here, scroll along, get down to system, and then I have these two options here. I have storage and I have controller. Storage mode means that Maschine will become a removable disk on your drive, which means you can import and export some samples directly to your machine. And controller mode means that this will become a fully fledged controller for the Maschine software. So if I click this, it allows me to save my project and it will shut down. Great, so now as you can see, Maschine is controlling the software, and theoretically we could just go along and start loading sounds and controlling it that way. The great thing about this workflow is that I can create this project on my laptop and then save it to Maschine and then open it up in standalone and integrate that with the rest of my studio. Now moving over to Push, if we go into the settings the first page we have in status, we have this icon here that says Control Live. This will flip Push from going standalone mode to controlling Ableton Live. So wait for it to connect. Cool, now as you can see, I have Push set up and is now controlling Ableton Live. I can go ahead and navigate through all of the content like I normally would using Push as a fully fledged controller for Ableton Live. Again, the benefit of this is that you have the ability to be able to start your projects in standalone mode and then bring them into Ableton and finish them there. And if I go over to this little icon in the browser column of Ableton, there's this button here that says Connect, and I can actually connect Push. If I enter in the number, and this means that I will be able to actually open up my user library and my project library and import them into Ableton to show all of the projects that I've created standalone. So all I need to do is to navigate to some samples that I have in my computer. Here we go, some loops, and drag them straight into Push, and that will install all those loops directly into your user library on Push. So next time you recall it in standalone mode, they'll all be there, ready for you to load up in your projects. So there you have it, my breakdown between Ableton Push and Maschine Plus. Honestly, I probably couldn't pick which one I like more. I've been using both Ableton Push and Maschine for a really, really long time. And they're both held a place in my studio, both for their differences and similarities. One comes with a battery, one doesn't, one's more expensive, one isn't, one has more expressivity, and one has a lot of sounds, samples, and effects. So there's a lot there between them. Let us know what you like, let us know what you think. Shout outs to Ableton, shout out to Native Instruments. We'll see you next time.